All right, so let's go ahead and start. So today we're going to be looking at the 21st homily, homily 21 by Chrysostom on children. So this is the family aspect, so we're not going to be so much on marriage this week, but on the family side of things. Looking at Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, which I will just quickly read here before we start discussing Chrysostom's homily on this. Chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Okay. So, if you have your books, I was actually thinking about it, and I forgot to do it, but I was thinking about texting a group text out like last night saying, if you have your books, remember to bring them. It's easier that way to reference it rather than to reference passages or page numbers if you have one. I do have actually a copy here. If you don't have one, I have one copy left if anybody wants it. So Chrysostom begins on page 59. We're on page 59. And I thought it was interesting, the first place he goes when he's talking about the first verse, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for it is right. And he talks about that. Paul goes right to the commandment. He says here, this is Chrysostom speaking, he will not speak here about Christ or other lofty subjects, but will direct his words to young minds. That is also why this passage is very short, since children have a short span of attention. Nor does he speak here about the kingdom to come, since children would not be able to understand. But he tells what a child's soul wants to hear most, how to live a long life. And so Chrysostom is saying Paul's pedagogy here, his way of addressing children differs from men and women. We saw in the previous 2 weeks when we were looking at Ephesians 5, the end of Ephesians 5, husbands wives, submit to your husbands, husbands, love your wives, that there was a lot of theological discussion basis for this, right? Because he talks about the relationship between Christ and the church and all of that. And then love your wife as you love your own body, for no one hated his own body, all of that. There's a lot more explanation, whereas the command for children here is very simple, to the point. Do it. There's nothing said about, well, because of Christ and this, relationship to Christ, or this is a fulfillment, for the future. So anything. He doesn't get into biblical theological arguments. He simply says, do it. The command says so. And he highlights the fact that this is the first command with a promise. This is also the first positive command, he says, which is really interesting to think about, the place of honoring parents within the Decalogue. So the first several commandments: you shall have no other gods before me. Do not make any graven image. Do not take the Lord's name in vain. Do not work on the Sabbath. All negative. The first positive command you get in the Decalogue is honoring parents, which Chrysostom says is really the most natural duty you have, is to honoring your parents. And when it comes to this command, he said it's, again, right to the point. He cites the law without a theological explanation. The implication here is, I think we could also draw, is that the law, you could just cite the law because the law is for children. So I have 2 points on this. One, the law given to the Old Testament Israelites is there's a teaching exercise in that. These are people coming out of Egypt with a slave mentality, who have been wandering in the wilderness, who need some basic directions for living in the land. It is meant to be simple. It is meant to be for children, right? And Paul in the New Testament is going to develop that and say the law has pointers, has arrows on it, right? It is meant for those. I think about it this way. Moses, think of Moses, right? He's had all this frustration with the people of Israel in the wilderness, and I imagine Moses sitting there in his tent during those 40 years and thinking, what do I leave these people? You know, of course, God is mediating the law through Moses, right? So it's not just his invention. But Moses has a human hand. He's putting on this. And Moses is writing and thinking, what do I leave behind for these people once I die, you know, so that they can continue to prosper in the land? And what he's writing is a history. He's writing laws that are easy to comprehend and understand. But for the good student, for the really good student who is meditating on this law, meditating on the Pentateuch day and night, is going to come to the conclusion that there's got to be something more than this. There's got to be, I can't live up to this. There is also more to these stories, and we could explore that. We were talking about that a little bit last week, where I was referencing Cyril of Alexandria a little bit in the Jacob stories. We would find in these stories, you know, if you meditate on these stories, what do these stories suggest? What do they imply? What do they point to? There's got to be more holding this together. And that's the purpose of the Pentateuch. As we read and study it, it is to, there's one level of understanding, but it's also to point us higher toward ultimate fulfillment, which is Christ, right? So what Chrysostom is saying here, by implication, is that the law, you can just cite the law to children. It's okay. You can do that. It was meant for teaching people at the most basic level, even the adults in the Old Testament. And so it's at a children's level. They can understand it. There's no need to go into a big, long theological explanation as to why you need to obey your parents. God said so. And it's the first commandment with a promise. It's the first positive commandment. It's your most basic duty. So that's one. The other thing that as I was thinking about this was, and here's where I want to just open up. There's lots of points today. I just want to throw it out there for some ideas out there for discussion. Is it okay? Is it appropriate, based on what Paul says in Ephesians and the way he says it, as well as what Chrysostom was saying here in Homily 21, to say to children, because I said so? I'm not giving you a theological explanation. Like, I don't need to tell you how this is in every way related to Christ and related to the kingdom and give you a whole seminar or lecture on this. This is the command. You are to honor your father and your mother. This is what it says in the law, the first commandment with a promise. That's good enough. Now, ultimately, we want to raise up and this is where Chrysostom goes further in terms of education, in raising them up in the discipline and admonition of the Lord and the instruction of the Lord. He goes there. But is there a place, I don't know, I'm sure we've all have said it, you know, but maybe sometimes we've said it and thought, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said it. Maybe I need to reason more. I'm of the mind personally that there's a lot of times with young children, because I said so is actually good enough. So does anybody differ with that? Does anybody want to add a qualification to that? Does anybody want to reaffirm that? What?
I'm just saying, like, if you told them in the past and you explained it to them and they, ignored it or whatever, yeah, you could say, I said so, afterwards, because you already explained it to them.
Sure. Okay. So if it's repeating a command and the explanation has already been given, yeah, there's a case too that the explanation has been given. But what about this? I think let me rephrase the question this way. Do parents have to be theological scholars in order to demand the obedience and respect of their children? Okay. Obviously, no, right? So, I mean, yeah, anything to add?
I was just thinking Proverbs 3, like, trust in the Lord, and it's implying don't trust in your own understanding. Am I getting that right?
The,
Proverbs 3, trust in the Lord with all your heart on your own.
yeah.
I'm thinking, I can't remember the text. I remember a song.
Yeah.
Don't rely on your own intelligence.
Mhm.
And like treating God as our Father, he's basically saying, trust in me. Don't rely on what you understand. In the same way, I think our expectation of our children can be the same way. They don't have to understand, because they can't sometimes.
Mhm.
Just like we can't understand what God is doing, our children can't understand what our intentions are at some level. Sometimes they can, but often they're not ready for that. So
Mhm.
do as I say because I said it.
Mhm.
You got to trust right now.
Mhm. What about situations that are not necessarily um, a clear right or wrong or moral, but it's just kind of the way we do it? This is the way we do it. There's a lot of instructions. There's a lot of commands, I think, like that within a household that, in this house, this is what you do when you get up in the morning. At this house, this is the time we go to bed. In this house, this is what we watch or what we don't watch. In this house, we eat this or we don't eat that. Now, if you don't eat, if you choose not to eat certain kinds of foods or to go to bed at a certain time, or you have a chore list when you get up or whatever, these are not necessarily, thus saith the Lord issues, right? So they don't necessarily have even a, they don't have a theological basis for them, number one. And two, could an argument be made that another household does it better, does it differently, and it's a better way to go? It's a better way to organize your household. In other words, does the decision absolutely have to be right? It doesn't have I'm implying no, but I'm trying to take it a step further beyond just, well, you don't understand this yet, but I understand it, God, from God's word, so therefore you're going to have to trust me. It goes, I would say, even beyond that to say, I may not have the perfect system way of dividing the chores. I may not have the perfect time to go to bed. I may not have the perfect judgment on what our diet is going to be, or what you can watch, you can't watch, you can read, you can't read. But the reason you obey me is not because I have the perfect answer, but because I'm simply this authority, and a legitimate authority that God has delegated authority to, in order to command you to do this or not do that. So I think even just in the command, or just the authority figure needs to be recognized. So and I think sometimes parents can fall into the trap of, because I've seen parents that'll do that, that'll be talking to a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old and sit there and trying to reason and explain and reason through everything and reason. No, this is why we do that, and this is why we do it. And the kid doesn't care. Okay, they're going to forget it 2 seconds later. They don't care. And then they'll come back and be like, now, didn't we just talk about this? We just talked about this. And because they didn't listen, right? So the point is, the feeling, one, that I think it's understandable, and I think it's relatable as well, is that as Christians, we want our children to understand. We don't want hypocrites, evangelicals really don't like hypocrisy. We were talking about it today. Ashes on foreheads or Lenten or anything ritualistic might turn into a hypocritical thing, and we don't like hypocrisy, so that's like the one sin you're not allowed to be in church, is sure you don't want hypocrites in church. So we don't want our kids to be hypocrites either. And so that's why I think there is a tendency sometimes to over-explain, because we want them to understand and do it with the right motive and the right heart and all of that. And furthermore, I think we want to be confident that when we say something, that we're actually making the right decision. Some people can fall into this kind of analysis or paralysis by analysis. I need to read all of these books on the issue to make sure what the proper bedtime is, or what the proper schedule is, or should I run my house. Because I want to do exactly what God says. I don't want to lead my kids in the wrong direction, and I need to have an answer for it. That's good. There's nothing wrong with that, of being informed and constantly learning. But I think parents need to understand that their authority is not dependent upon how perfect they are or how well they are conforming to God. Like, you are called to honor your parents, whether your parents are Christians or not, whether your parents are obeying God or not, whether they have the perfect plan or not. They are an authority figure. Unless, and Chrysostom qualifies it, he says it's in the Lord. So it's not, saying, hey, if you're being called to sin, that's a different story. So that in the Lord phrase in there qualifies it. But other than that, if you're not being called to sin, parents have that authority to lay down the rules and to enforce them, even if they're not the perfect rules. And I think we need to understand that as parents, that your authority is not dependent on, and maybe we feel that way. Like, I didn't read my Bible today. I didn't pray today. I messed up, at work today. I shouldn't have done this. And it's like, I'm not in a position to discipline my kids, right? Because I've had failures. No, you are, right? Your kids are expected to honor and obey regardless of your failures. Now, again, that is not to say, do as I say, not as I do, because Chrysostom is going to spend most of the time in this chapter talking about modeling obedience. But I think we need to start there with this idea that Paul goes back just to the command. He doesn't give a theological explanation, tie it to anything but the basic command. Children, I got nothing new for you. Go back to Moses. Honor your parents. Honor your father and mother. This is the first command with a promise you will live long in the land. And that's it. And that's where he leaves it. And then he moves on to fathers, and which is where Chrysostom's going to spend most of the rest of the homily talking to parents. Talks about parents. He made a statement in there. I wrote it down. Parents, after God, deserve to be the first to receive the fruit of your good deeds. If a man does not honor his parents, he will never treat others with kindness. And this goes back to something we've talked a lot in this church about as well, about your duties locally, closest to you, who has priority in terms of neighbor love. Are you loving there's the kind of liberal abstraction idea, whereas I love the world, but I don't get along with anybody I know. I love the church. I want to go serve God, but I can't settle down at any local church because I don't get along with anybody. We all probably know people like that. People who bounce from church to church and can't find a body they fit in with, but they're just all about the church. They all, love God, love the church. Well, if you can't get along with anybody that is close to you, the people you have an opportunity to serve, it is an indicator of where your heart is really at. And so when in families, if you can't honor your parents, the idea that you are a good son, a good daughter, even as an adult, and fail to show honor to your parents, even as an adult, the likelihood that you are really being kind to others beyond your closest circle is quite low. So the pattern of love in Scripture is we love God and then love neighbor. Neighbor being I reject the classic Sunday school answer of the Good Samaritan. Who is your neighbor? It's everybody. I don't think that is a good answer. I think that's a way of making an abstraction out of the concrete. In the Good Samaritan, the neighbor was the person that the Good Samaritan came into contact with. That was the person put in his life that day to help. That was his neighbor. That's Jesus' point. Who is my neighbor? When he asks, Jesus says, here's the guy the guy who helps. The guy who, when there's a man half dead laying in your path, right there's a neighbor for you. You don't have to think about, sorry, not today. I'm saving up for a missions trip, in Africa. Can't help you. Your neighbor's right here in front of you. And so in Scripture, neighbor love goes outward from God to family to parents. to those people you actually interact with, the people you live around, the people you go to church with, the people in your community, and then in concentric circles out from there. And so Chrysostom, I think, reaffirms that point. Parents after God deserve to be the first to receive the fruit of our good deeds. All right, so moving on then to fathers. Do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and admonition of the Lord. Chrysostom says, this is a really interesting observation, that Paul does not say love. He does not say, fathers, love your children. He says, fathers, do not provoke your children. And he says, this is Chrysostom's words, he does not say love them. This is on page 60, bottom of page 60. He would regard such a commandment as superfluous, trusting that nature will draw even unwilling parents to the love of their children. So he's saying parents naturally love their children. Now, I'm sure we can think of exceptions to that, where, parents hate their children, want to kill them. We have abortion, right? But what's interesting, even with abortion in this country, is maybe if you've been involved with any pro-life centers, anything like that, what they'll tell you is that there will be girls that come in seeking an abortion, and seeking counsel for an abortion. They'll go to some pro-life clinic, and one of the biggest tools that the pro-life organizations have is ultrasounds. And they will push, they get the ultrasounds in there and somebody qualified to run them so that they'll say, come on in, we'll help you. They're not saying, no, you can't get an abortion, you can't get an abortion. They say, come in. Why don't we get an ultrasound? Why don't we find out what's going on? You get an ultrasound, and more than any other factor, changes minds. Because it's not a blob of cells, right? There's a living being, my child there, I can see it. Can see him or her. And that is the biggest piece of technology in terms of preventing abortions in these pro-life centers. Now, that's not to say you can't do it other ways and convince people and go to scripture and all that, but it is a really helpful tool. A lot of these clinics will tell you that, is if you can get them to see the child, there is a natural impulse that starts taking over. That's my child. So he says, love is not the command. He's going to presume, he says, that fathers and mothers, that parents are going to love their children. The command is, do not provoke your children to anger, but to bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So this is where he's going to spend a lot of his time. And so what does this mean, to bring them up in the instruction and discipline of the Lord? He talks about teaching to obey. Helena brought up last week about the music from the previous homily, satanic music, and you were asking about that. He has another reference to that on page 61. Let me find it. I thought I had it underlined. Maybe I don't. Oh, yes. So he says, it's necessary for everyone, it is on page 61, to know scriptural teaching, and this is especially true for children. Even at their age, they are exposed to all sorts of folly and bad examples from popular entertainments. So, I mean, back in the 300s and the 400s, this could be written, in the 2000s, popular entertainment today, right? Imagine Chrysostom, 300s, the popular entertainments today. You just got to watch out for this stuff. It's not like it used to be, right? In the 300s saying this. Our children, he says, need remedies for these things. So he talks about avoiding bad examples through popular entertainment, talks about teaching obedience, and then he also talks about the next section I do have underlined, which is most interesting, where he talks about schooling. He says, we are so concerned with our children's schooling. If only we were equally zealous in bringing them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And then we wonder why we reap such bitter fruit when we have raised our children to be insolent, licentious, impious, and vulgar. May this never happen. Instead, let us heed the blessed Paul's admonition to bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So he talks about schooling versus discipline and instruction, dividing those two things. Parents much more concerned that their kids have enough opportunities, that the kids have enough, credits, for college, or that they have enough skills, that they have enough social interaction, that they are not left behind in life. Yet, how many parents, he says, are concerned about the discipline and instruction of their children in the Lord? And so I think we could expand on that. And at this point, I'd probably just be preaching to the choir to talk about, well, what kind of schooling? Okay, what does that entail? Is there a right way or a wrong way to do this? I'm not going to go there again because I think that's a different class. But when it comes to schooling, we should not think of that as some kind of neutral space. Right? That as if there is there's this area of life we can cordon off and put all of our biases to the side, put all of our religious affiliations to the side, and simply school in a neutral, clean atmosphere, right? And you all know all of this, and you could probably replace me and give a mini lecture on the same thing. I think we're all in agreement here on that. But schooling, so to go beyond his point, so schooling versus instruction and discipline in the Lord, but also when it does come to schooling, what does that mean? I don't think the point to walk away with here is, well, I'm just going to emphasize, discipline and admonition of the Lord, whatever that means, and not schooling, de-emphasize schooling. But I think here the call would be to run those things together. And the schooling should not just be lowered in comparison, but actually should be brought up and should be intentional in the way it is handled. The education is handled within the household. He, in the very next sentence, talks about the pattern to imitate. He says, let us give them a pattern to imitate. From their earliest years, let us teach them to study the Bible. He repeats this over and over again, you say. We're sick of listening to it. This is from the children's perspective. He's quoting from the children. He repeats this over and over again. We're sick of listening to it. Never will I stop, and that's the end of the quote, never will I stop doing my duty. Why do you refuse to imitate the holy men and women of old? Tell me, especially you mothers, think of Hannah's example. Look at what she did. She brought Samuel, her only son, to the temple when he was only an infant. Who among you would not rather have a son like Samuel than one who became king of the whole world 10,000 times over? But it's impossible, you say, for my son ever to become as great as he. Why is it impossible? Because you don't really want it. You won't entrust him to the one who is able to make him great. Who is that? God. Hannah commended Samuel into the hands of God. The high priest Eli had no real ability to form him, since he even failed to form his own children. It was the mother's faith and zeal that made everything possible. He was her first and only child. She didn't know if she would ever have another, yet she never said, I'll wait until he grows up. He should have a taste of worldly pleasures during his childhood at least. No, she rejected all these thoughts, for she had only one object, how from the very beginning she could dedicate her heart's delight to God. So he continues talking about patterning the example. One of my favorite quotes from Doug Wilson that I constantly is in the back of my mind is that the goal in bringing up children is not for them to adhere to the standard, to meet the standard. The goal is to love the standard. And so you can't, you can get your children to adhere to a standard by reinforcing it over and over. This is the standard. This is the standard. Meet the mark. And in order to save themselves pain or trouble, they will get used to meeting the standard, only to reject the standard the first time they have the opportunity to do so. The goal is to progressively get them not only to adhere to the standard, but to love the standard and adopt it for themselves. That is the goal, of bringing up children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Not only passing on the rule, but passing on the love, which, again, the way I started out class, talking about it has to start with you just obey the rule. Like this is how we all learn. We have to learn how before we learn that we love it and adopt it and it becomes habitual in our life. It has to start there, but that is not to say just do as I say, not as I do. It is not to say just learn to practice following the rules. The goal is to ultimately love the standard. And it's something that weighs heavily on my mind, anybody in ministry, that it's very telling that you can have a household of someone in ministry that is well ordered, where the children comply with the standard. They obey, there's nothing untoward going on. And yet, you see even sometimes people in ministry that soon as children are out of the household, it reveals that they hated the standard the whole time. And that's a hard pill to swallow. But it's something to keep constantly in the back of our minds in terms of education. Not are the children checking the box and complying out of their own interest, out of their own short-term interest? Are they being yes men or yes women, yes sons or yes daughters, in order that they can go get their free time or play their game or have their privileges and avoid bad negative consequences? Or are they progressively coming to love the standard? And that can only be done by patterning that standard. If it's apparent you don't love the standard, they never will. So patterning providing a pattern to imitate, and then he goes on the last part, teaching them to love true wisdom. And here, and this is on the top of page, actually, let me read the one middle of page 62. He says, let everything take second place to our care for our children, our bringing them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. If from the beginning we teach them to love true wisdom, they will have greater wealth and glory than riches can provide. And then over on the top of page 63, it's interesting. Again, this is an early church father in the Eastern Church who is speaking somewhat negatively, maybe not negatively, but he's not upholding the spiritual life of a monk as the highest goal. He says over here, a pattern of life is what is needed, not empty speeches, character, not cleverness, deeds, not words. These things will secure the kingdom and bestow God's blessings. Don't sharpen his tongue, but purify his soul. I don't mean that worldly learning is worthless and to be ignored, but it should not be an exclusive preoccupation. Don't think that only monks need to learn the Bible. Children about to go into the world stand in greater need of scriptural knowledge. A man who never travels by sea doesn't need to know how to equip a ship or where to find a pilot or a crew, but a sailor has to know all these things. The same applies to the monk and the man of this world. The monk lives an untroubled life in a calm harbor removed from every storm, while the worldly man is always sailing the ocean, battling innumerable tempests. I had to stop and think, this is Chrysostom and not Luther, right? I'm thinking, is this like, this is Luther 101, talking about monks. And no, this is Chrysostom, prior really to the Middle Ages, talking about the East. Actually, somewhat critical of monks living an untroubled life, where he says the Bible's not just for monks, for these spiritual people. If anything, it's more necessary for those who are out sailing on the waters, not in a cloister. So I thought that was really interesting, coming from the early church. That maybe the reformers didn't make it all up after all. Maybe not. All right, so let's see. He talks in the next section, beginning on 63, about great men. He says, and this is another one, which a little point that he makes, just a passing reference, but it's just interesting coming from him, where he says, married men are in no way inferior to the greatest ascetic. So that hasn't crept in. That medieval thinking of the ascetic life is somehow a higher calling than marriage hasn't come into the church yet by this point, where he can say that. But he says, he asked the question, what is it that made the great men? And here he's talking about the great men of the Old Testament. It mentions Noah, Abraham, Joseph, Moses. He says, and he gives a three-pronged answer here. Because of hospitality, detachment from riches, and a well-ordered life. So hospitality, detachment from riches, and a well-ordered life is what makes a great man. I have a note here on classical education, and I don't know why I put it there. I was going to make a connection to class. Oh, I know why. Okay, never mind. I got it. So here's my last thought, something I wanted to maybe spend a little time talking about, which is an extension of this whole idea of, bringing up children who are, fit to be sailors, to use his metaphor. And he talks about, and this relates actually to what the sermon was about this morning, and he says, wealth is a hindrance that leaves us unprepared. If you're trying to prepare your children in every way, make them comfortable, give them everything that a child should have, in a way you are weakening them in that they are unprepared to be uncomfortable. They're not used to going without something. And so talks about internal versus external strength. He says walls and fences are artificial supports. Likewise, wealth and fame are artificial supports. So if you're trying to provide security for your children, walls, fences, and whether that's financial security or, as the word is used negatively today, sheltering. I don't think that's supposed to be, should be a negative word, but that's the word that's used. Walls and fences are not going to give them the internal strength that they need in order to go out and face the world. So wealth and all these things, comforts, are a hindrance that leaves us unprepared. And then he gives the really, I think, just such a powerful illustration when he talks about, this is the bottom of 64. This is just the great, I even put a note, the first time I read this, I have in the column, sermon illustration right here to use someday. He says, wealth is a hindrance. This is the last paragraph on 64. Therefore, wealth is a hindrance because it leaves us unprepared for the hardships of life. So let us raise our children in such a way that they can face any trouble and not be surprised when difficulties come. Let us bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Here's what the illustration. Great will be the reward in store for us, for if artists who make statues and paint portraits of kings are held in high esteem, will not God bless 10,000 times more those who reveal and beautify his royal image? For man is the image of God. I thought that was powerful. The artists who go out and are hired by kings, think of the Sistine Chapel, think of these great portraits, these statues, these great works of art. And we know these renowned artists, hundreds, of years later. They have great fame because they made this beautiful piece of artwork for a king. How much more, he says, for those who, I quote, will not God bless 10,000 times more those who reveal and beautify his royal image. This is what we're doing in raising children, revealing and adorning or beautifying the image of God within man. We have young image bearers, and our job as parents, like a sculptor, is to reveal. One artist said something about, who was it? Maybe one of you could quote, I'm sure Evan could, about the idea that, there was, a big tree stump and, that somebody carved out, or it was marble. It was a big block of marble. Somebody carves out of it. And somebody asked him, how he does that. And he says, well, you see it. It's there. It was there all along. I've just revealed it. It was on the inside of this big block of marble all along by chipping away. That image is what Chrysostom is using here. This idea that we have young image bearers that have been entrusted to us, and our job is to reveal the image of God in them by chipping away all of the things that block out that or obscure or blur that image. And so reveal and beautify, adorn. I like that word, adorn. So if you have, you can kind of have a simple beauty, of form, where things have the right proportion. So if you look at a wall, you look at out a window, the window is proportional to the wall. There's a kind of simple beauty of form in that. But then you can adorn it, right? You can add curtains and decorations and adorn what is already there to make it more beautiful. So that language of reveal, I think of the sculpting image, and beautify, adorn by putting paint on something, decorating. That is what our job is as parents, to reveal and adorn or beautify the royal image which exists in these image bearers that God has given to us. So I thought that was the most powerful line of the whole homily, to think about what our job as parents is. There is, on the last page, a comment here about that could be, I think it's worth thinking through. It's going to hit us, I think, as objectionable when the way he says this, but I think it's worth thinking through, where he says, just if you listen to this carefully, if we have an undisciplined wife or unruly children, shall we not have to render an account for them? Yes, we shall, if we cannot offer to God what we owe him, because we can't be saved through individual righteousness alone. If the man who buried his one talent gained nothing, but was punished instead, it is obvious that one's own virtue is not enough for salvation, but the virtue of those for whom we are responsible is also required. Which brings up the major question is there, what do you mean, John Chrysostom, by salvation? How is he using that word salvation? Which is, I think, a discussion in and of itself. What does he mean by salvation? When he says, it is obvious one's own virtue is not enough for salvation. Well, I think, I don't plan to get to the bottom of that today, but I think it's worth, should we just reject this out of hand? Or how could he, or would it be a profitable exercise to think through, how could this be taken in a way and reconciled with what we believe, and that you cannot be saved? What are you saying? If my kids don't turn out, I'm not going to heaven? Or what does he mean by this? I think he's heavily leaning on a kind of covenantal model of salvation. There's no doubt about that. Okay, he certainly does not have the individualistic kind of view of salvation we have today. That's obvious in the early church. I don't think anybody did. But I would say it's a questionable doctrinally quote that's worth thinking through and saying either, there's no way I can reconcile this, I think he's a little off here, or saying in what way could he possibly be correct? How is he defining salvation? So I'll leave that to you to meditate on or think about. But I would say this: the challenge here for me is, how do you do this? The practical how, when it comes to when he says wealth is a hindrance. How do you prepare children to be, and this is where my classical education note came in, how do you prepare children to be, to have character formation? How do you form them in terms of character and in virtue? But also having a desire to provide a level of security, and not just financial security. But I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about with this conference, right? In the fall, is we want to build generational wealth. We want to provide financial security for our children. We want long-term financial stability. But even just beyond the financial, you think about those in the world who seem to be best equipped for confronting obstacles and challenges and working their way through it. You hear their backstory, and what is it? Oftentimes, it's not, I grew up in a comfortable, middle-class, secure home where my parents were, always around it. It's, I grew up in a rough neighborhood. I didn't have a father, right? I had to figure things out on my own. My parents got divorced. My parents were fighting. There was trouble in the household. I was poor, and they have all these kind of horror stories, and that's what kind of equipped them to take on every challenge they face. They seem to get richer and richer, more and more successful, because every obstacle they see is just another opportunity, right? They've been broken into this. So as I was, just thinking through this, I honestly, this is something I think we should think and talk about a lot more, the how-to, because I don't have an answer for this, because I have a strong desire to protect my children, to build walls and fences, to provide for them, to give them a kind of financial security, to give them a stable, very stable home life. So I'm not saying, why don't you wreck your marriage a little bit, challenge your children. But what I'm saying is this idea of trying to provide an environment, not only in the home but in the church and with all whom they interact, that gives them a real sense of security, that they don't have to see all of the evils of the world, and they don't have to experience all that. But how do I balance that with, not fitting them for a monastery? Right? Am I raising kids in trying to provide this kind of security that are only good in a monastery? And so balancing that out is, I think, where a lot of wisdom comes in, and where I think a lot of us can be helping each other, thinking through, what this looks like. So this is where I pitch it out to you, and the conversation can continue. But that was my challenge, the challenge to myself as I was reading through this homily. But yes, Blair? Sure. You know what? Why don't we do this? I'm going to follow Josh's model. We'll pray so that it's not an awkward ending, So I'll pray to close, and then just open up for discussion. And if you say that's enough for me, I'm out of here, you can walk off. You can continue to discuss as long as you want. So that just makes it less awkward, so that people aren't saying, "Can I leave? Can I go? How long do I have to stay?" So let's pray. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for the opportunity to come together to worship freely. Thank you for the opportunity to fellowship with one another, to be encouraged from your word. Thank you for the voices that you have raised up in the history of our church, like John Chrysostom. And we ask, Lord, that you would help us as we think through these critical issues, how we might apply your word and the teaching of those men you have raised up in your church to our own lives, in a way that would be most glorifying to you and would be to the good of ourselves and our households. And we ask you for this grace in Jesus' name. Amen. All right.